A warm welcome to the Uxbridge FM History Show, and we welcome back Ken Pearce, history guru extraordinaire, to the show, and he's got a story about Emily's diary.
Yes, hello everybody. In an earlier talk, I spoke about a copy of a diary which I have, and which was kept by a young woman called Emily Fern in the first 9 months of 1853. The family lived in Windsor Street, on a property that still stands today. Emily's father had died when she was only 3 years old, so she was living with her mother and her sister Cecile. She was aged 20. But mother had remarried a man called Henry Kingsbury, and there were 2 young children of that second marriage. Emily usually called her stepfather Mr. K, Henry Kingsbury. Her mother, Mary Hannah, had the maiden name Weedon. Her father, John Weedon, was still alive and had an important job. He was estate manager at Hillingdon House for the owner, a banker called Henry Cox. The Hillingdon House estate later became RAF Uxbridge, of course, and has recently been renamed St Andrew's Park. So Emily's grandparents lived in a pleasant residence on that estate. One item from John Weedon's life survives today. He wrote a pamphlet entitled A Treatise on the Growth of Cucumbers. There is a copy in the British Library, and we have a photocopy in Uxbridge Library. There is also a record that in 1832, John Weedon made a bet with a friend called Benjamin Betteridge. Weedon wagered a £6 rump stake that Betteridge could not walk from the Red Lion and Hillingdon to Ivor Church and back in less than an hour. Betteridge did it in 53 minutes, and so he won the stake. And you can spell the word stake whichever way you like. In her diary, Emily mentions 2 projects that were taking shape in 1853. The first being that Uxbridge was about to get a railway. The Great Western Railway began operating through West Drayton in 1838, but of course Uxbridge, 2 miles to the north, had missed out. The people here had been pressing for a rail link for ages, and now at last it was happening. Construction of a branch line had begun. So in the diary, Emily saw the work proceeding on a walk to Cowley Church, and she also saw a bridge being built over the road near the Packet Boat Public House at Cowley. That branch line opened in 1856. The other scheme she saw was the development of the Hillingdon House estate by Charles Mills in Vine Lane. Mills, a wealthy banker, was having a new house built, and he was laying out the surrounding grounds. In July, Emily went to see that house being built, having got permission from the head gardener. And on another occasion, she wrote, "Went to Mr. Mills to see a large beech tree moved from one part of the grounds to 100 yards distant." The grounds were clearly being landscaped. Well, Charles Mills' son eventually was created Lord Hillingdon, and that house today is now the American Community School. Henry Kingsbury, Emily's stepfather, was the owner of a building business and a very practical man, but it's nevertheless surprising to learn that he had invented a machine to give electric shocks. People came to the house to get a shock. He took it to the George Inn to give the patrons a shock. Most surprising, though, is this entry. Mr. K's machine goes on famously, wrote Emily. He insulated Cecile on 4 glasses and then gave her a series of shocks, and sparks issued from her body. Can you picture that? This 19-year-old girl balancing on 4 glasses, 4 tumblers, and sparks coming out of her body. I'm sorry that I do not have the knowledge to explain how the machine worked. Since Emily became 21 in February of that year, you'll not be surprised to learn that certain young men figure in her life. All the sons of local tradesmen. That was her level of society. But she seems particularly fond of a young man called Willie Shoppy. That's spelled S-H-O-P-P-E. Now, that's a most unusual surname, and I have been able to discover its origin. In the 18th century, a French army officer was taken prisoner by the British and brought to this country. He liked living here so much that he never returned to France. But the French, of course, were not popular in this country at certain times, and so he decided to change his surname. Chapuis was his original name, and that became the rather ugly Shoppy. Well, there are many entries in the diary about Willie Shoppy, and he does seem to have been a very kind and gentle young man. But a lady called Miss Rayner appeared to have disapproved of their friendship and made it known. Diary entry, March the 22nd. I saw Miss Rayner. She looked at me with a glance of contempt. That made me feel uncomfortable, and Willie Shoppy did not walk home with us. Next day, March the 23rd, met Mr. Shoppy. I told him that our intimacy, that meaning has changed a bit, intimacy was talked about. So we had better take leave of each other for some time, a few years perhaps. I cried, and we said farewell. 4 days later, went to church with the 2 children. Mr. Shoppy kept looking at me all the time, but I would not return his look. April the 3rd, saw Mr. Shoppy. He spoke to me. I am so glad. April the 8th, saw Mr. Shoppy. He gave me half a crown for the widow who lives opposite us. I cried. I walked with him for about half an hour. That's not keeping our contract, I think. Well, after that, their friendship continued uninterrupted. But I've discovered that in the end they did not marry. I found that 4 years after this, Emily married an engineer from London called William Culverhouse and went on to have 10 children.
10 children? Oh dear. I'm not sure about the health and safety of the shock machine either. That sounds decidedly dodgy.
I just don't have the scientific knowledge to guess what he was up to, how he did it.
Was it one of those Van de Graaff generators that you
do you think so?
Make static with? I don't know. I'm the same. I'm not particularly up on these things.
Caused a stir at the time, anyway.
Yes. Well, thanks, Ken. We look forward to more from Emily's diary in the future. Sounds very interesting.
Thank you.